Ukraine, the place that's always on our mind right now. Ukraine. How do we feel hope, let alone maintain it, when all we see is violence, destruction, death, and exile? When we open our newspapers and turn on our tellies and look at what's unfolding in the country at the moment, it's hard to feel hopeful. The smashed buildings, the burnt-out tanks, the columns of smoke rising from once beautiful city centres, the queues of distressed women and children waiting for trains and buses. We see the dreadful patterns of history repeating themselves once again, the despair of past generations rising to the surface. Once again, we witness a modern, free, and democratic state, Europe's newest state, defending its values of liberty and tolerance, of political representation, and of a justice system that's free from political interference, defending those values from invasion by a neighbouring tyrant. The echoes of previous crises in the West reverberate down the centuries, all the way back to the Persian Emperor Darius, waging war against the Greek city-states between 500 and 450 BC. He was a tyrant who was similarly enraged by the prosperity, modernity, and individual freedom of his neighbours. But invasion is part of our own mythology of being English. We felt the fear of it when the Roman legions withdrew in 410 AD, leaving our peaceful island to the ravages of the Danes and Saxons who descended on these coasts like wolves upon our folds. The Romans retired to Rome to defend the city against the rampaging invasions of the Visigoths, and we were left in relative peace until another tyrant came storming across the Channel and conquered England in 1066. Our independence was given up. We lost our democratic system of regional parliaments, the Waitangamets, to this tyrant from Normandy. And then a few hundred years later, in the reign of Elizabeth I, there was the great fear of the Spanish invasion, the Spanish Armada, an invasion army floating in the Channel. And just 170 years after that, Bonnie Prince Charlie's clansmen were massing on the borders, ready to descend from Scotland into England. And just 50 years after that, Napoleon amassed an invasion force of 500,000 people, 500,000 soldiers at Boulogne, which would have undoubtedly landed on our shores if Nelson hadn't defeated the French Navy at Trafalgar. And then we only need to go another 150 years forward, and we are waiting here on this island as the Nazis amass an invasion force after the fall of Dunkirk. When you consider our country's history and the fear of invasion that is embedded in our psyche, it's not surprising that all of us feel the agony of the Ukrainian people in their time of crisis. Wherever we look, history unfolds us. President Putin honed his skills in bombing and shelling civilians by helping his friend, President Assad, go to war against his own people, whilst Western governments turned a blind eye. Like so many others, I felt a sense of absolute outrage and injustice at the horror inflicted upon Syria's civilian population, at the millions of tragic refugees fleeing the bloodshed. As a soldier in the British Army in the late 1970s and early 1980s, I had served in 2 civil wars in Northern Ireland and in what was then Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, and I'd also been a war artist in Bosnia during the Yugoslavian civil wars in 1996. So I could easily imagine the suffering, visualize the destruction, and hear the thump of artillery shells. I had to do something, but what on earth was it to be? I have few skills and very few practical skills, and I couldn't think of any anything, any contribution I could make, apart from writing endless letters to the heads of our different governmental departments. And I generally thought that painting is not necessarily the best medium to express a political opinion in. But I decided to try and make a war painting. Soul by Soul and Silently was conceived after a visit to New York for the opening of an exhibition of mine. And the day after the exhibition opened, I went to the Metropolitan Museum of Fine Art, and there in the medieval wing was this beautiful carved Pieta, a Spanish carving painted and dating from about 1400. And the central pyramidal construction in the bigger pyramid of the figures in the painting is based on this mother holding her dead son. And it struck me so strongly when I saw this image, and it seemed to tie in with what I felt about Syria at the time. So I thought I would have a go at making something that was in my mind a kind of Renaissance altarpiece. I gathered various newspaper photographs, clippings and cuttings, and looked at the work of some of the earlier Renaissance painters. And this composition, which, whether you look at it from the left-hand front edge or the right-hand front edge, leads you to the woman standing at the top, who is clearly asking some kind of question to a Western soldier. And he represents the impotence of the West. He's saying, I'm so sorry, I can't help you. All around these figures is the destruction of their peaceful civilian life. They sit amidst the ruins of Aleppo, and in the background, the city that had been shelled repeatedly by Assad's army, killing tens of thousands of civilians, is shown in its battered state. I've borrowed various figures from other sources. The woman in yellow on the bottom right-hand corner at the feet of Christ, she comes from a Fra Angelico painting. And behind her, there's a little boy with a bandage who is borrowed from a painting by Gogo, as is the girl on the bottom right as well. The other figures come from newspaper cuttings. I made an earlier version, which I never finished. You can see from this study that it's not a finished painting. And the format, I didn't feel the format was quite right. I couldn't get that big sense of the pyramid. So this painting was never finished. But I did make a second version, which perhaps is more painterly than the painting on the altar in the Lady Chapel. And by that I mean the paint is thicker and richer, and it perhaps reads less like a Renaissance altarpiece and more like a 20th century or 21st century painting. The figure in black has been replaced by a man picking up a stone. Behind the woman in yellow, there is a man picking up a stone, a broken piece of masonry. And he represents the total impotence and desolation felt by people whose cities have been reduced to rubble. As it happened, I had momentarily forgotten that I had been in Bosnia as a war artist. And this pastel sketch here, which I made on the front line in Bosnia in 1996, provided the basis for an oil painting, which I'll show you in a minute. Like many of you, I was horrified by the unraveling of Yugoslavia. As a result of the fall of the Soviet Union, an ugly form of nationalism, of violent nationalism, arose from the remains of the Republic of Yugoslavia. And the Serbs in Bosnia rose up, abetted by the state of Serbia, and tried to push the Bosnian Muslims out of their towns, out of their villages. The UN described it as the first genocide in Europe since the Nuremberg trials. And I went there the last winter of the war, after the massacre, just after the massacre at Srebrenica. And you might recall that Douglas Hurd, who was then Foreign Secretary, had agreed with his UN compatriots that safe areas would be created and defended by United Nations blue beret wearing troops. And these would be refuges for the Bosnian Muslim population. And at Srebrenica, a Dutch battalion tasked with the job of defending this community capitulated in the face of the Bosnian Serb general Mladic, who's now in prison in The Hague, and allowed 10,000 men and boys to be rounded up and taken to a factory some miles from Srebrenica, where they were all machine gunned to death, all 10,000 of them, and their bodies dumped in mass graves. And I think most people in Bosnia, the soldiers I talked to, the British soldiers, the American soldiers I met, felt something similar to what the Ukrainian soldiers must feel now, a sense of absolute disbelief and absolute outrage that communities that had lived side by side for hundreds of years could do this to each other, could inflict this violence upon each other. And here in the drawing you see soldiers from the light infantry, a British infantry regiment, who are busy in a frontline village finding refugees who have nowhere to go and connecting water pipes so that there's some basic services, and caring to those who are too ill or too badly hurt, too badly wounded to leave their half-demolished houses. This is the painting itself. This, unfortunately, is a photograph of the painting. It's a photograph of a photograph. I have somehow lost the transparency from 1996, and the painting hangs in a military headquarters somewhere. But I think it clearly shows the state of that poor country. I've always been interested in the psychology of the soldier. Soldiers are ordinary men called upon to perform at the edge. They're called upon to give their very utmost in ways that most of us are not called upon to do so. And actually, just before the Bosnian trip, I bumped into a chap who'd been my old platoon sergeant in the King's Road, and he was now a regimental sergeant major at the Royal Hospital at Chelsea. And he said to me, would I be interested in painting some of the old Chelsea pensioners? And so it was set up that I would meet these three heroes from the Second World War, and I would paint them. I was deeply moved by these three men who had endured an extremely rugged Second World War. All three of them took part in the disastrous Dieppe raid in 1942, which was Churchill's rehearsal, or his attempt to show the war planners that an amphibious landing against the Germans in France would work. It was a shambles. There was no artillery support from the Navy, no air cover, and 2,000 Canadian and British soldiers were rounded up by the Germans and marched back to Germany and spent the rest of the war in a prisoner of war camp. 1,000 soldiers were killed, and a few hundred got back to Britain. And the chap in the middle, who was a sergeant major in the Royal Engineers, he got back to Britain, and he then fought all the way through Africa, North Africa in the 8th Army, to Sicily, and up through Italy. And somehow you might think these men who had endured such extreme privation and had been introduced to such immense suffering and had seen such suffering in other people, somehow you might imagine that they were brutalized or had become brutalized. But it wasn't the exact opposite. I've hardly spent time with three men who were so at peace with themselves, with their philosophy, perhaps with their maker. They were men at peace, full of kindness, and it struck me at the time that there is some kind of link between suffering and hope. So hope was on my mind when I painted this picture, Twilight by the Westway. A year later, probably the 95, 96, something like that. And I had been painting in that rather desolate looking building just beneath the Westway, which in fact was an old British rail depository, and it's sandwiched between the railway line at Paddington and the motorway. And I had been painting my model, and after the session ended, she was met by her boyfriend on this damp November evening, and the boyfriend gave her a big hug, and there I was saying goodnight to them, and their image was reflected in the puddle, and it just struck me at the time that even in the rather grim environment of Paddington New Yard, there was love, and thus there was hope. So we go back now to one of the first definitive war paintings. And in fact, this was probably the first painting that I remember really being fascinated by as a child. I was taken to the Louvre aged 11, and like many kids taken to a museum, tramped round behind my parents looking gloomily at Renaissance paintings. And then suddenly there was Delacroix's Liberty Leading the Revolution. And I thought this was the most tremendously exciting picture. Apparently I sat on the floor for half an hour and wouldn't be moved, so fascinated and enraptured by the story that he was telling, a story of history. And as many of you, I'm sure, will remember, the 1830 revolution was not the French Revolution, but was the revolution that swept aside Charles X, who was the youngest brother of Louis XVI, and ended the years of dysfunctional Bourbon royalist rule. Delacroix was a social liberal, a leading romantic painter of his day, best friends with Hector Berlioz, who wrote his Grand Messe des Morts to commemorate this event. And as social liberals, they felt it incumbent upon themselves to comment on the times in which they lived. And so here we have, right in the middle of the painting, we have liberty, the symbol of France, clutching the tricolour. And on the far left, we have a man in a beret, and he is wearing the beret of the elite École Polytechnique, which was their premier postgraduate educational institute. So he represents bright talent. He's the future. And then the man in the top hat, he's a member of the bourgeoisie. Even he, who has lots of wealth, and perhaps he's a lawyer, or maybe he has an unearned income, but he's there with his rifle, he's siding with the revolution. And then on the far right, we have a boy with a bandolier and two pistols. And he represents the working class. And so what Delacroix was doing is saying, this revolution is for everybody. It's giving everybody an opportunity. The painting was exhibited at the Salon in 1831, and needless to say, the revolutionary government found the painting too revolutionary and asked that it be removed quickly, lest it disturbed the citizens and provoked another revolution. So the painting, which is 12 feet across, not an easy thing to hide. The painting had to be sent to Delacroix's aunt, who lived in the country, where it was hidden, and not hung until after the revolution of 1848, when it made its way to the Louvre. Delacroix said, "If I haven't fought for my country, at least I've painted for her." Some of you will know this painting. A very different atmosphere. There's no glory here. There's no sense that tomorrow is necessarily going to be the dawn of a glorious new future. We have here Goya's extraordinarily modern painting, commemorating the events of the 3rd of May 1808, when Spanish civilians rose up against the occupying French army during the Peninsular War. And it's a modern painting because it's dispensed with all the conventions that previously constituted classical history painting. He's created this line of almost uniform, this repeating pattern of uniform, faceless, emotionless soldiers. The French soldiers with their rifles aimed at the Spanish partisan, and he has his arms raised in a Christ-like pose of supplication and surrender, and yet he's going to be shot to pieces just like those bodies crumpled on the floor underneath him. It's unremitting and terse, and the hope lies only in the fact that such courage did eventually, combined with Napoleon's hubris, bring about a change in Spain's circumstances. Kenneth Clark, the famous art historian, said, "This painting is the first great picture which can be called revolutionary in style, revolutionary in subject, and revolutionary in intention." We're almost, well, we're just a decade later here, and this image is very well known, this painting is very well known. I'm sure everybody here would have seen it at some point. There are many pastiches in this painting. What is it about? Well, of course, perhaps the first thing that comes to mind when you see people who are quite clearly refugees, we are brought back again to thinking about the Syrian crisis and now the Ukrainian crisis, with more millions of people, refugees. Who are the people on the raft? Where are they going and why are they on the raft? Well, it's a political painting. It's a sort of war painting, but it's a political painting that is a direct response to the restoration of Louis XVIII after Waterloo, and the incompetent royalist government replaced the officers in the French Navy that Napoleon had promoted on merit. They were replaced by the hopeless sons of French aristocrats. And the French naval ship, the Medusa, was on its way to French West Africa, and it ran aground off the coast of Senegal. And the officers and the senior NCOs leapt into the very few lifeboats and set sail for the coast of Senegal, leaving 200 sailors on board the ship. Those sailors cobbled together a big raft, and without any sense of being able to control their direction, they flung themselves at the mercy of the elements. And they stayed on that raft for 13 days, buffeted by the wind, slashed by the rain, frazzled by the sun. And the water ran out, and the food ran out, and there were terrible stories of cannibalism and murder. Eventually, when the raft was spotted, there were just 13 people alive. Jericho, incensed by the newspaper reports of what had happened, and feeling that this was a symbol of the absolute incompetence, self-indulgence and greed of the royalist government, painted this huge painting, this extraordinary work of art, its composition, this flow of outstretched arms from the bottom left to the top right, this pyramid of despair. He painted it very quickly in 6 weeks, flat out. So strongly did he feel about the story. The painting was exhibited in the Salon of 1820. And once again, the government found it too revolutionary, too uncomfortable, and wanted the painting to be, they wanted the painting to be destroyed. And Guernica had friends in England, and the painting was carefully wrapped up and shipped to England, where it went on a tour for 2 years, pulling huge crowds of people. There was plenty of revolutionary fervour in England at the time. And now we move on out of the Romantic period, and we see the 19th century's most famous war artist at her zenith, Lady Butler. Unusual to have a woman war artist in those days. There have been quite a number in the 20th century, but she was the preeminent recorder of history between about 1860 and 1900. And she was commissioned to paint this huge painting of the heroic deeds of the 28th Regiment of Foot at Quatre Bras, which was the engagement that happened 2 days before Waterloo. And she strove here to achieve authenticity. That was what she wanted to put across. What was it really like? She wanted the viewer to feel what it was really like to be in one of those redoubtable infantry formations, the square, when faced with Marshal Ney's cavalry thundering across the rye fields. So she managed to persuade the Royal Engineers to lend her 300 soldiers, who she formed up in Hyde Park, and drew them and had them photographed while they repeatedly fired their muskets. She watched the smoke drift across the formation. And here you see the classic English defensive square with the front rank holding their rifles with their bayonets fixed to repel horses, and the standing rank firing above their heads, and the colours at the back. We see a lancer on the left and a fallen cuirassier on the bottom right-hand corner, and some say possibly Marshal Ney on his horse on the top right. She painted from life. So back in her studio, many of these soldiers modelled for her in position, and she even asked a bunch of school children to run through a field of rye in Sussex so she could see what a trampled field looked like. I imagine the farmer wasn't that enamoured. So this is a very different sort of painting. There's no political statement here except that of the British Army doing its duty as well as it could. Very different to the way Sickert dealt with the German invasion of Liège in 1914. And he read reports about how heroic the Belgians had been. And he made this painting, he said, in tribute to their courage. And it sort of feels a bit heroic, but actually, as so often with Sickert, it's much more about picture making than it is about the sentiment. They seem relatively faceless, these soldiers, and they seem to have been reduced to part of the overall pictorial design. So you see that great lozenge, sweeping curve of dark indigo, the shadow on their tunics, which is echoed in the curves of the wheels of the cart, intersected by those horizontal lines of the rifles that they're firing, and all painted in that classic Camden Town palette. It's hard to know what Sickert really felt looking at that. But it's much easier to see what Nevinson felt when we look at his painting, La Mitrailleuse. Sickert said about Nevinson's painting, he said, "This is the most concentrated utterance on war in the history of painting." So Nevinson had been at the Slade a couple of years earlier, and then the war came, and he joined up and drove ambulances on the Western Front in late 1914, 1915. And of course he saw the full horror of the war up close. Before the war, he'd been very influenced by the Italian futurist movement, and he worshipped fast cars and speed and all the hard-edged, hard angles of modernity. He thought the future was going to be fast and glorious. And the future was fast, all right, but not in the way that he'd imagined, and of course exposed to the horror of the Western Front. We have a mechanical arrangement of parts here. People have been reduced. The future has come. It is a modern future, but it's an apocalyptic, diabolical future with each individual soldier here painted with sharp angles, just like the machine gun and like the wooden support for the trench therein, the tangled wire. It's an example of where an artist has created a language that completely reflects his intention and expresses his emotional reaction to the subject. This is not reportage, this is a man expressing his innermost feelings. He painted the picture whilst on leave and then returned to the Western Front a year later as a soldier. He was at the Slade with Paul Nash, who painted this painting in 1918, We Are Making a New World. This is possibly the most widely known war painting ever made, and Nash had been invalided out of the Hampshire Regiment in 1916, just before Passchendaele, having been very badly gassed, and he came home on leave, and after he had recovered, up to a point he recovered only, but after he had recovered sufficiently, he was asked by the War Ministry whether he'd go back to France as a war artist. And he returned to France. He said to his wife, "I am a messenger who will bring back word from the men who are fighting to those who want the war to go on forever." So he returned to France and spent the next year of the war making over 50 drawings of the road from Ypres to Menin. And he developed a private language of his own, which is infused with the latest art from France. He had seen Roger Fry's post-impressionist exhibition in 1910 and in 1911, when Roger Fry brought the works of Picasso and Cézanne and Matisse and Gauguin to England for the first time, and they had never been seen in England before, and those paintings had an enormous impact on the young artists of the day. So borrowing post-impressionist language, but somehow creating a variant of it, which was so staggeringly personal and so modern and so unseen before, so totally novel. And he portrays a grim sunrise, a huge, ominous red cloud representing the blood of the slain soldiers. And here, in this horizontal landscape pierced with shard-like trees, he lays open the desolation of nature, the total obliteration of life before the war. A year later, he made what he believed to be his finest painting, and what a number of critics have described as the greatest war painting of all time. And it is hard to think of anything that perhaps is more moving than this picture. And once again, Nash, using his language of post-impressionism with a dash of cubism, has unravelled the horror of the Western Front. This is the road to Menin, and you see the upended slabs of concrete, the twisted corrugated iron, the huge pools of stagnant water, unexploded ordnance lurking in the bottom. You see the tangled wires, the apocalyptic shafts of light that appear from behind the clouds, and the plumes of smoke from artillery shells that are scattered along the horizon. And right in the middle of this inferno, of this total hellish landscape, are two British soldiers leaning at a slightly crazed angle, trying to make their way through the wreckage. And behind them, two small figures who seem almost to be dancing in a kind of crazed madness. Did Nash feel hope? Did he have any hope that what was being unleashed would turn into a better world? He had a difficult time after the war. He had huge fame as a result of these paintings. And then he lost his way as a painter, couldn't find a subject that moved him, joined the Surrealist movement and painted perhaps never wholly convincing Surrealist paintings. And then, towards the end of his life, just before the Second World War, he remembered that he'd spent a lot of his youth drawing the Whitnham clumps, which is this mound on the Wiltshire Downs with a clump of beech trees on the top. And it meant a lot to him in his youth. And in his later life, ill from the effects of gas, with terrible lungs, and his marriage in difficulties, he refound his connection to nature, and he abandoned Surrealist painting. And as he started to paint nature, he refound his Christian faith. Nash was a Christian Scientist, and both he and his wife shared a mentor with Ben Nicholson. And Nash found in nature, just as William Blake had and Samuel Palmer had, a metaphor for the mystery and the magic of creation, the perpetual cycles of death, birth and renewal, which are shown here in the setting sun on the right and the rising moon on the left. When my grandfather was in his early 90s, he died when he was 95, and he had fought all the way through the First World War, I said to my grandfather, "Do you believe in God?" And my grandfather said, "I don't know whether anybody who's been through the First World War can believe in God, but I do believe in the miracle of creation." And here we see the miracle of creation. Here we see God in nature revealed in all his sublime mystery and glory. Nash sought to portray the inner meaning of life, the inner meaning, what he called the things behind what you see. You can imagine William Blake or Samuel Palmer looking at these late paintings of Nash and feeling that romantic spirit, that being in touch with the mystery through nature, was somehow alive and well and in good hands. Well, This painting, again, many of you will know, and needs a little bit of unravelling. I think most of you here will be aware of the events of Guernica when, in the second year of the Spanish Civil War, Franco asked Hitler for artillery support and aerial support, and von Richthofen's bomber squadrons flew into Guernica, which is a town in the Basque Country, on an early summer day, the sun shining and the market in full flow, and dropped tons and tons of high explosive on the town. Hundreds of women, children were killed. Most of the men were away fighting in the Spanish Civil War. Franco wanted to destroy Guernica because it was the centre of Basque culture, as well as being one of the key bastions of resistance, Republican resistance against the fascist regime. Picasso found it very difficult to make a war painting. He was asked by the Republican government in Spain to make a war painting to commemorate Guernica. And apparently he looked at this huge canvas which he had stretched for him. He looked at it for week after week, not knowing what it was that he was going to paint. And then he came across the American photographer Dora Maar's black and white photographs of the event. And that suddenly illuminated his imagination. And so he's created a very Picasso take on the photograph, hence his decision to paint it in black and white. And we see all around symbols that reflect the terrible events that have happened. In the top of the painting you see the electric light bulb. But it's interesting that the light doesn't come from the electric light bulb. It actually comes from the old oil lamp that is held by a woman's arm coming from the right-hand side. It is the oil lamp, the eternal oil lamp, that is the source of hope and spirituality in this painting. And at the bottom we see the dismembered soldier who's holding the sword of defeat, the broken sword, the sword of defeat. But out of the sword of defeat grows a white poppy, the eternal symbol of hope. We see Picasso's turning bull. We see a woman on the right burning. We see the horse. We see his feeling, his idea of newsprint all torn up. That is the body of the horse that looks perhaps like chainmail as well. The painting is full of messages and stories, and you can go on YouTube and watch several films, several interpretations. Picasso legendary wouldn't speak about the painting, and so people hasn't stopped other people speaking about it. There are plenty of different interpretations. It's also important to notice the stigmata on the bottom left-hand corner of the soldier's hand. This painting was in Picasso's studio in Paris, or so the story goes, in 1942, when the Nazis were occupying Paris. And a German delegation came to visit the world-famous artist in his studio. One of the Nazi officers said to Picasso, pointing at Guernica, "Did you do that?" Picasso said, "No, you did it." But not every artist during the Second World War or the First World War felt the need to paint the war itself. And here we see Matisse's still life with Sleeping Woman, painted as Nazi jackboots strutted up and down the Champs-Élysées. And we see a very gentle painting, a woman seated, leaning her head on a table, various objects that Matisse would have painted, and then his famous cheese plant, which was for him always a symbol of hope. It's such a gentle painting, and perhaps that's an interesting way of responding to crisis, is to try and think of the things in life that are really worth hanging on to. Beauty, colour, reflection, composure, peace, tranquility. Matisse avoided painting what he felt would not be true to his vision, which was always an optimistic vision. He said, I want my art to be viewed in the way a comfortable armchair enfolds the sitter. He wanted the art to embrace people. In 1951, this chapel at Vence, which had been designed by Matisse, was opened. He contracted stomach cancer in 1941, and he advertised for a young and pretty nurse to nurse him through his recovery from the operation. And he became very fond of this nurse, and she was called Monique Bourgeois, and in 1943 she took holy orders and became part of the staff at the local Dominican monastery. And when it was revealed that the monastery was looking to build a new chapel in the town, she asked Matisse whether he would get involved. And Matisse was enigmatic about the possibility of faith, of Christian faith. He had been a strong believer in his early life, and it had lapsed. And most critics think that this was his return to his earlier calling, his return to his Christian faith. And he spent 3 or 4 years working on the very simple but very powerful designs of this space. Stanley Spencer had been at the Slade with Paul Nash and with Christopher Nevinson. So it's interesting seeing his work in comparison to what we've just been looking at. Spencer served first as an infantry soldier and then as an army medic in the Macedonian campaign in the First World War. So he was spared the horrors of the Western Front. But nevertheless, he did see action, a lot of it, and after the war, he was commissioned to make 13 huge paintings for a memorial chapel near Newbury, the Sander Memorial Chapel. And this is one of the murals. Well, actually, they're not technically strictly murals because they're painted on canvas and then hung against the wall on wooden supports. But they look like murals if you go into the chapel. And the thing about Spencer's faith was he believed in a combination of strength, personal strength, combined with personal acquiescence, of accepting what happens to you, accepting fate, living with modest ambition. He thought you should be both confident and diffident at the same time. And it wouldn't be authentic for him to paint the kind of painting that Paul Nash painted. So he painted this almost whimsical vision of an officer who has just paused his marching troops. They've been on a route march, it's very hot, they've sat down, they've drunk from their water bottles, and many of the soldiers are picking almonds from the almond trees that are in blossom, and the officer is looking at the map. But it has humour, and it has a sense of deep comradeship and companionship, brothers in arms, all together. It almost makes you smile. Stanley Spencer never lost his faith, and it remained this group of paintings remained for him the greatest contribution he'd made to art. And it's perhaps worth, when you look at this painting, it reminds me of Milton's comment that the mind is its own place and in itself can make a heaven of hell or a hell of heaven. Summer 1917, when Bonnard was painting this, he could hear the German guns on the Marne. The Germans were only 25 miles from Paris. But Bonnard painted not the war, he painted paradise. He took the observed world and cloaked it in something otherworldly. Like Paul Nash, he sought what was behind the objects that he was looking at. He sought to reveal its inner meaning, to create a picture of heavenly peace, even though humanity was yet again tearing itself apart. Fabulous palette, extraordinary colouring, totally individual, totally authentic. You see the three children on the bottom left corner, peacefully playing, and no thoughts of war here, just a sense that if we could only be nicer to each other and kinder and concentrate on the small things in life, we might also be able to enter some sort of earthly paradise. He was an interesting painter, Bonnard, because his career more or less exactly mirrored that of Matisse and Picasso, although he died younger than Picasso. And Picasso dismissed it. Picasso said, Bonnard, why on earth would you want to take Bonnard seriously? Bonnard's problem is that he can never make up his mind. He uses all sorts of different colours. He's not a modernist, he's a realist. But I don't think anybody could look at that and think that Bonnard was a realist in the sense of trying to copy nature. But he uses nature and reinvents it in a way that expresses his earthly vision. There are some critics, now Andrew Graham Dixon is one of them, who thinks that Bonnard was the greatest of all those French painters of the 20th century. He painted hope rather than despair. Here, painted in 1941 as, once again, the Germans occupied the streets of French towns. His wife, Marthe, who had already died by this point, was still one of the main sources of inspiration for him, and still one of his favourite subjects. And he's painted her here from drawings in the bath with his beloved Dachshund sitting on a mat. The war can't get inside his mind. He's thinking of Milton, and he's making a heaven out of hell. And the interesting thing is, if you go to Bonnard's house at Le Canet, and you look at this bathroom, which you can go and see, you find that the bathroom is just an ordinary bathroom with white tiles around the bath and white tiles on the floor. And yet here in the mind of Bonnard, it's a celestial place. This lithograph, is a piece of Soviet propaganda. As you may remember, or not remember, but you may know, I'm sure, about the Great Famine, 1931, when somewhere between 8 and 12 million Ukrainians died, starved by Stalin's insistence on collectivizing the farms in the rural belt of Ukraine that was responsible for feeding the Soviet Union. And this appallingly dishonest poster was made to convince the rest of Russia that wasn't a problem, and the fact that there wasn't much food on the table was an illusion, not reality. But you only had to look at the poster and you see these very well-covered people being stuffed full of Ukrainian wheat. Well, of course, now we know what happened, and we're reminded of the fact that Ukrainian farmers are unable to sow their wheat this year, and Ukrainian wheat accounts for 38% of the world's wheat needs. Here we see perhaps a slightly more honest form of Soviet propaganda, an earlier form of Soviet propaganda. Women workers, take up your rifles. And that's fairly straightforward. Spencer Gore, 1914, the First World War has begun, and like his fellow countrymen in France who paint, he's chosen to reach for hope. He's chosen to paint the landscape outside London with a fervour and intensity and hopefulness, I imagine being so horrified by the unfolding politics of the time. He's got his mind singularly focused on the miracle of creation, on nature, on the cycle of death and rebirth. Tragically, he made 7 or 8 of these paintings in a 3-week period, and unfortunately caught pneumonia and died before the year was out, aged only 39. But painting hope has always been something that's been at the root of my own need to paint. And in times of crisis, but also not in times of crisis, I have struggled to paint a vision that is optimistic and romantic and positive. And I just happened to be in Cornwall in 2016, one June morning, and I got up very early and went out with my dog at 6 o'clock in the morning and sat on the cliffs beside a little town, a little village called Port Scaffold on the Roseland Peninsula. And the sun came up and a boat set sail from the harbour, and all of the flowers on the cliffs were in full bloom. And this is a painting about hope. As is this painting, which was a memory of the sun and painted last year, but really harking back to earlier memories. And I find also this connection with nature, but also in that tradition of Matisse and Bonnard, in interiors, the small things, the everyday objects, the things that we surround ourselves, if only we could stop and sit and just contemplate, we might find that inner peace, that hopefulness, that tranquility, which we strive to have in our lives. And this is a painting of my mother in her conservatory. She's just about to be 87 and is coming from Scotland, leaving her home in Scotland and coming down to a retirement village near Bristol. And I painted this painting because I knew even 4 years ago we were discussing the possibility of her moving from Scotland. Her husband, my late stepfather, had been dead for maybe 15 years or so she's very much on her own. But she has the most fantastically optimistic spirit. And here she is sewing in her conservatory the Scottish winter outside, surrounded by her geranium cuttings and completely in a state of joy, because that's how she's managed to face the crises, of which there have been many in her own life. And then again, in the last year of Butler's life, he brought about the completion of a series of paintings he'd made during the Second World War, called The Studio in the Canet with Mimosa. And there is this astonishing mimosa tree. And each one of them gets more celestial, more otherworldly, more spiritual, less connected to the earthy world in which we live, freed from the restraints of actuality, liberated by reinvention and imagination. To my mind, of all the paintings that 20th century painters have made, this, for me, is the most articulate and intense vision of hope. And so it brings me back to where we started, thinking about the tragedy in Ukraine, wondering what sort of life will await those refugees as they seek solace in the kindness and good-heartedness of the neighbouring countries. And we wonder what sort of state they will return to find their country in. Their homes gone, their streets full of mines, and as we probably, most of you heard on the news this morning, as the Russians withdrew, the mass graves, the bodies piled into huge craters and tied to bicycles in the streets and shot in cold blood. It's happening again. What can we do? Well, we must be mindful and aware, but we must still be full of hope for the future. Thank you.